So I'm Sean Asbjorn-Hargens, founder of MetaIntegral, and I'm here with my core team, Shanti and Claudia. You can raise your hand so folks can identify you. Welcome to the first of 4 webinars that we're having as a way of kind of kicking off the next year of activities. MetaIntegral, we have a number of things that we're doing over the next 12 months related to the MetaImpact Framework, one of which is this webinar. And then we have the master course that starts in February. And then we're just about to announce our next 5-day seminar in Australia, which is going to be in October. So just basically a year away. And that announcement will probably go out in the next few days. And then we have a number of client engagements and different things that are happening. So this webinar is really about creating a larger conversation with people who are involved with social impact or different initiatives around measuring impact, having more impact, working with multiple forms of capital, different bottom lines, and so forth. And so we have a number of different themes. Kind of the overarching theme for the series for all 4 conversations is, what are the expressive capacities that we need in order to have the conversations that are so crucial to this moment in time. In other words, we're facing a lot of complexity and challenges, a lot of opportunities, and it feels like we need new distinctions, we need new frameworks, we need new ways of looking at reality and how we approach organizations and their role in the world. And so the series is really about identifying some key themes in the context of social impact so that we can talk about what are the distinctions, the powerful distinctions that we need to be exploring and engaging in order to have the conversations that need to happen so that we can create the world that we know is possible. Right? So that's kind of the overarching frame for the series. Tonight, the focus is on impact and like how can social enterprises and social impact initiatives have more of the right kind of impact, right? So they're good at having impact, but are they having the right kind of impact? And what does that mean? Because this notion of impact gets thrown around, and so we kind of want to dive in and start to explore what do we mean by impact. And each of these topics, these 4 conversations that we're going to be having over the next 4 months, one a month, are linked to one of the key distinctions or dimensions of the MetaImpact Framework. So while we'll talk about the MetaImpact Framework, in various ways during these 4 conversations, we're not necessarily wanting or needing the focus of the conversation to be about the MetaImpact Framework, even though that's kind of a background context for some of what we'll be talking about. So we really want to have all of you drive the conversation with your experiences around trying to have impact, designing for impact, measuring impact, and then looking at how might the MetaImpact Framework with some of its distinctions and dimensions kind of support us to engage in that process in a new way. So just in brief, I'll just, you can go to the website and learn more about the MetaImpact Framework if you're new to it. But just a real high-level summary is there are 4 kinds of impact, which is kind of part of the focus for tonight. There's what we call deep impact, clear impact, high impact, and wide impact. We'll say more about what all of those are as we go. So that's one layer. Another layer is that there's different types of capitals. There's multiple types of capital. So there's like financial capital, which we're all quite familiar with. There's also human capital, social capital, psychological capital, and so forth. So there's 10 of these types of value that we've identified and use in our approach. But there's a lot of different models out there that work with multiple types of capital. And we're friendly to all of them because we're MetaIntegral, right? So our move is to be big and include it all. Another distinction is that you can actually measure those different capitals through 3 types of data. First person subjective data, second person intersubjective data, and third person objective data. Together, we refer to that as integral data. Integral data is when you include all 3 types of data. So this is essentially bringing together qualitative and quantitative, or what's sometimes referred to as mixed methods. so that in the study and of impact, we feel we need to combine and bring together both kind of the more hardcore quantitative approaches alongside, what are sometimes referred to as the soft, metrics, that we challenge that. We don't feel that's an appropriate way of describing it, but nevertheless, that's some of the language we've inherited, and so we work with that. So there's these three types of data. So that's the third layer. The fourth layer is around different bottom lines, and that at least three bottom lines: people, planet, and profit. But to that we add a fourth, which is purpose. And so there's a lot of people who have been developing the notion of a fourth bottom line. In many cases, it's purpose, and so we are including that. So each of the conversations is going to kind of tie into one of these four dimensions. So that those of you who are new to the MetaImpact Framework can kind of learn more about each of the distinctions that I've just mentioned through each of the four conversations. And many of you who are with us are very familiar with the framework. Several of you were with us in Iceland, so great to see you there. And so let me just also mention, by way of kind of introducing MetaIntegral, that MetaIntegral is an organization based in San Francisco initially, but we have networks of coaches and consultants and practitioners in Brazil and in Australia. Those are our two major kind of areas of networks. But then we also have people all over the world. We have a growing network in Iceland, actually, due to Claudia and Tanya and others who are doing this work there. And so our vision is to meta-integrate. It's to take a big picture view and just bring in data and insights from all kinds of traditions and disciplines and approaches. And our mission is to be impact, so that we really embody impact and we live impact, and that we do that through the four types of impact that I mentioned before. And one of the things that we do as kind of our strategy is to make value visible, right? And that's one of the things that the MetaImpact Framework does so well, is it helps us see these values, track them, and coordinate them and amplify them. So hopefully that gives you a little sense of MetaIntegral as an organization. And so let's, there's a lot of folks here, but I'd love to, just hear from a few folks, maybe three or four, around why you wanted to join the call tonight, and kind of what your connection to the notion of impact is. And I think that'll serve to just get some of your voices into the space and get a feel for some of the people who are with us. And then I'll ask Shanti to tee up a couple of the initial questions, and then we'll just open it up to conversation and kind of see where you want to take it. So either take yourself off mute or raise your hand, and we'll just kind of have a few of you share with us your name, where you're from, and just kind of what brings you here tonight. And I'll call on you too because I can see all your names. Any volunteers to kick it off? All right, it's a shy group. All right, great. Oh, there you go. All right.
Hi, I'm Kieran from Australia, and I have got a consultancy that does sort of futures thinking, innovation, and service design across the health, education, and community sectors, and have some familiarity with the MetaIntegral sort of framework and approach. And I'm curious about obviously the course that'll run next year, and I'm keen to dive in a little bit today to get a bit of a sense about whether that's going to be a good fit or not. Mainly the reason I'm pretty keen to learn more about the framework and how it might be applied to our work is a couple of things. One, when we do innovation, whether it's in education or health, inevitably the conversation turns to, well, how do we measure success? What does success look like? Like, that's always one of the key innovations that people are turning to say we need to change how we think about success. And I think the framework potentially offers one option or guide around how we might kind of broaden those notions of success, and then how we might actually start to measure it more effectively. The other one is that we've got a product that we're kind of building called Crazy Ideas College, which is working with young people to do crazy good in the world, and looking at how we might use the meta-integral kind of framework as a way of our thinking about the impact that we have. So that conversation around social innovations having the right impact is one that's resonant for me.
Great. Oh, those are both spot on. And yeah, I'm always amazed that so many of us are asking this question, how do we measure the success and the impact? And it seems like, how is it we haven't cracked the code on that? You know, like that's still kind of a question that we're all trying to figure out. Like it seems like we should have figured that out. So great. Thanks, Karen. Great to have you with us. And yeah, I hope that you're able to join us in Australia if it feels like a good fit and the timing's right.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, a couple more. Holly, you want to jump in? I just took you off mute.
Oh, so. Thanks. Yeah, thanks. Read my mind. I'm Holly Harlan. I live on Whidbey Island, and I currently work for the Whidbey Institute, and also I work for Pacific Integral, and I've been involved in the Pacific Integral GTC program. And at this moment, we have our 19th cohort upstairs, so I'm very excited that I get to kind of be on the periphery of this group of folks going through the GTC process. And so the reason why I joined this program in particular is that I have a lot of economic development in my background. I started in economic development focused on manufacturing in Cleveland, Ohio. So, and I'm more and more interested about moving more back into working in large complex systems. So when I saw I've been working a lot on individual change and my own change and more of the interiors. And I'm more curious again about how would I go back into working in economic development, and this idea of wisdom economies really struck me. And so I'm curious, and I'm leaning in, and I'm all ears to say, oh, how can I learn something more that might then give me something new to bring back into that world if I choose to move back into economic development. So.
Oh, wonderful. Well, that's great, Holly. And you know, I'm talking with Terry O'Fallon tomorrow. And one of the conversations we're having is around how we can partner between MetaIntegral and Pacific Integral with respect to creating a new inventory as part of her stages model, focus on economics and using the MetaIntegral framework around that. So that's great to hear that you're kind of representing the team there.
Yeah, definitely. And actually upstairs right now, they're learning the stages developmental model just today. So it's in the field, Sean.
Good. All right, let's hear from one more, and then we'll have Shanti tee up kind of our initial conversations. Anyone ready to go? Yeah, Brian. All right, you're off. Oh, I just unmute. Oh. You're good. You're good now. Brian, tell us.
I'll give this a try. I've got a lot of background noise. I'm in the Student Center at Virginia Tech, and it's game night tonight. So what you just said, Sean, in response to Holly about Terry O'Fallon, myself and Lex Neal just within the last couple of weeks had also conferenced with Terry because of our work and interest in the interface or interrelationship between state stages and structure stages, and that's quite a hot topic. Here, with the work that I'm doing on the ground in Roanoke, related to Roanoke Community Ecosystems, which is a 501c6, the socioeconomic is really a model that is grounded in integral thought and practice. We put a tremendous amount, myself in particular, in working with Lex more as the theorist, and kind of working at the cutting edge of theory, translating the theory to the learning process and to facilitate practice. And so just to touch on your initial question, and then I'm done, about what distinctions we could make to better frame or work more effectively with the social collective contexts, I would suggest in relation to the off-wall model that the state stages translate as soteriology or liberation, the autonomy in the socioeconomic context, and that the structure stages are more epistemological in nature, and that we really get focused on primarily those two. I mean, that's state stages are waking up, structure stages are growing up. We do a lot of work with the Presidency Institute in terms of showing up. I'm just developing more of an appreciation for shadow and how that translates even into small group work. We're doing a lot, or I continue to do a lot of small group work. Thanks for the time.
Yeah, great. Good to have you with us, Brian. Let me just make a couple comments, and then Shanti, you're on. So, Brian pointed to a couple of things that I think are worth just highlighting. One is the MetaImpact Framework is kind of a technology of social revolution. And I don't say that lightly, but, one thing that I've come to realize for myself is that if you want to change reality, change what we measure and how we measure it, right? And so a big part of changing reality is kind of expanding the field of what we're measuring and how we go about measuring it, because then that allows you to include more of reality in the sphere of what is. And so part of the power of the MetaImpact Framework is that it supports us in including more of reality in our initiatives, in our projects, in our organizations. And it does so in a way that really works with kind of mainstream, right, in terms of measuring and tracking and making visible what's there. The other thing is that we're really interested in kind of how can people working with this framework actually use it as a collective practice for doing shadow work, because it kind of forces you in the best sense, in a lovingly sense, to have the conversations that are often difficult to have in an organization. It kind of forces the organization to do their shadow work. And one way that I've often thought about integral business is business that's aware of and actively seeking out their shadow and engaging their shadow. And so there's a lot of shadow around finances and measurement. And so there's a lot of ways in which the framework supports organizations to be able to get into those topics and issues in a skillful way. And the last thing is we're teaming up with a couple of different organizations around software development and starting to figure out how do we build value accounting software such that when people use it to track these different capitals, that it actually grows their consciousness and actually allows the evolution of their own individual consciousness, as well as collectively as a group and a team and an organization, so that the interfacing with the software actually informed by adult developmental theory nudges people up the spiral, so to speak. So all of that's just to say that I think, Brian, you touched on a number of key topics that we're very interested in actively exploring. So with that, Shanti, if you could frame up where the conversation should start, and then we'll see where it goes.
Excellent. And thank you for that input. So what does having impact mean? I've asked different people, and every single time I get a different answer. The concept itself is a very subjective concept. And then how do we differentiate, compare, and integrate different definitions of impact? There's a huge focus and growing focus today in the world on having more impact, but there's, a million different definitions of what that can mean. So how do we step above that and take the higher picture view and analyze and evaluate and compare and contrast them? And then why is that important? That's important because, as Kieran said, how can we move towards the transformation we want to create in the world if we can't tell what the level of success is, towards getting there? If we can't be clear and collectively cohesive about what impact we want to have and what are the effective ways to measure that. And so clearly there's no one answer, but the MetaImpact Framework can guide us, and we want to hear what people have to say about their personal experiences with wrestling with these questions and what type of guidance they ideally would like to see in this regard. And Sean, kind of bouncing it back over to you to open it up and, for discussing these.
Great. So I really want to just open it up, invite all of you to come forward and share kind of your engagement with this topic and this question. We're not going to answer it tonight. I mean, all four of these big questions that we're bringing to these conversations, require a longer engagement to really answer. But, and so whether you have familiarity with the MetaImpact Framework or not, like, we're really wanting to hear from you so we can have a larger conversation around this issue. So who wants to kick it off with either adding to the question or sharing your own experience with this topic? Ellen?
Sure.
Great, you're on.
I'm unmuted. Hi everybody. So yeah, and hi from Toronto, Canada. As you can see, it's very cold here. So, so my work is with social justice and climate justice advocates all over the world. And one of our programs focuses on financial resilience. So there's your shadow area. So all these organizations, NGOs, nonprofits, they need to fundraise, and we are supporting them with that in a I believe, quite an integral way by looking at the three intersections, finance, communications, and fundraising. And so we believe that financial resilience happens at the intersection of those three areas. And of course, doing this work, we had to sort of put a marker out there. It's like, what does success look like? And then, so the first complication is it's a way of being and not necessarily a destination. Financial resilience is a way of interacting with a very complex, ever-changing external environment. It's not just the funders, but it's also governments who are closing down and putting pressure on organizations, or basically telling them they can't receive foreign funding anymore in India, or different places, So it's a very dynamic field. And we created a framework where we looked at the three functional areas I mentioned just now, and then came up with success indicators. And in the success indicators, as a integrally informed person that I am, we're like, okay, the 4 quadrants checklist, make sure that we cover them all. And I think we did a pretty good job. But it's so that's sort of one dimension. And when I look at the framework that you developed, Sean, and and others, and I know this is sort of a beautiful work in progress. I was part of some of the earlier stages, and it's great to see it now. I ordered the card set, so I can't wait to see it. It's like, so I'm really using it as a checklist, and also because I'm focusing on money, which is one form of capital, to really also expand it so that the model is aligned with the world that we want to create. So now you get a little bit more philosophical. It's like, we want fair and life-sustaining societies. So what economy, what kind of financial transactions, or any kind of transactions and transformation, so we can make it quite big, So yeah, I'm just really intrigued and really looking to learn and see what you have. And the other dimension I'm curious about is, so there's also the way of looking at outputs, outcome, impact, and I think, Shanti, it's a little bit the question, what is impact? And impact is really, in the systemic, in the lives of people, in the quality of things that have happened way down the line. So I find impact a really heavy word. I try to talk more about outcome on the way to impact. So I'm curious how you see that sort of longitudinal, that other dimension, when we talk about impact, and how that feeds into the framework, or how the framework supports that. So anyway, lots of questions. I'm really curious. So happy to be here.
Great. So just say a little more about how the framework supports which dimension that you were highlighting.
Your framework, or?
Yeah. Or I thought maybe you were asking, wanting to hear more about how the MetaImpact Framework supports some aspect around the outcomes and,
Yeah, so it's more like I'm looking for indicators, maybe, that will, so if I look at the meta integral framework, it's a conceptual framework, and I can see the third the dimension kind of going out, like output, outcome, impact, longitudinal. How does that Have you thought about that, or how is it integrated in the framework? I'm not seeing it, or is that what you ask of us, to work with as we are using the framework? Is it more of so the framework more at the upper left, in the upper left quadrant of helping us rethink and connect with purpose in a different way,
right.
And it is also a tool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is great. Anyone want to build on or amplify what Ellen is talking about? And then I can Runa. Or Brian, let's have Runa go, and then I'll have you go. Go ahead, Runa.
Well, I come to this by accidentally being in Iceland earlier this year, where I heard about the 5-day workshop you were doing, and I was able to attend the tail end, the public event. And I come from the conscious capitalism movement, which of course is introducing different business model. I'm not an academic, but I was in Iceland in August, and I did give a talk about the triple bottom line to a bank there. And I was very excited to introduce MetaImpact there as an example, because to me, I feel it is so inclusive and expansive, and helps me also to place where I am in terms of my contribution to the whole. But also what you were talking about, in Iceland, of course, I added the purpose. I choose the purpose as the fourth bottom line. And I am currently working privately with, just to upgrade myself, up-level myself and my message, with Tim Kelly, who is the founder of the True Purpose Institute. And he works also heavily with the shadow. So I really like how this is layering on everything. So he works individually with people who are looking for their purpose, and he says only 3% of people who find their purpose can actually manifest it, because they can't move forward because of the shadow. And he is also starting to work more with companies on their purpose, and it's the same thing. So I get really excited when I hear about how the shadow work needs to come more into the organizational aspect.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'll wait to respond. Brian, you wanted to jump in there?
Yeah, I was just reflecting a little earlier in the day on shadow, how shadow presents itself in small group work, typically as a projection, that an individual will be projecting their own shadow, kind of their own misgivings, or their own narrative in terms of why they aren't more fully present with the work. And it's kind of so that showing up kind of interrelates with cleaning up in that collective context, and for a moderator, a group moderator, to kind of develop a sensitivity where they see that, to be able to keep, because it becomes so disruptive to the group's narrative and to that process of shaping the group narrative. It's a big part. I just proposed yesterday to John Fullerton's Capital Institute the co-creative project to address changing the story, because that's kind of a theme in their, perhaps going back to Katie Teague and Katie Teague's interview and work with I know they share that. So the group narrative, I think, is an important underlying component. Basically, why I raised my hand in terms of, I think another thing and I'm seeing in like the local community, nonprofits who are failing because they are relying upon the contribution of monetary dollars to sustain themselves. They're relying upon that, and they are also relying upon volunteer work, and the need and appropriateness of continuing to incentivize the volunteer aspect. And I know this, Sean, this is something that Meta Integral a year or more, had kind of dabbled with. It may be part of the reason for my recent interest in game theory. I'm playing Township in recent months. My 11-year-old grandson got me hooked, and it's kind of because the overall design of the game in terms of complexity is so intriguing in terms of the logarithms and the underlying design and learning how to play that game effectively. The interesting thing is they completely virtually eliminate the human element from it. So, you don't have that dimension to kind of contend with. Right?
Great, thank you. Let me just make a couple of links maybe between some of the comments. Ellen had talked about financial resilience, and then, there's this, topic around the shadow. And, one of the things that, we have a lot of shadow around money. And so part of what the framework does is it helps us look at, like, what do we mean by financial capital? Because, like, typically we think of it in terms of the third person dimensions of, the P&L statement, the balance sheet, how much money's in the bank, what's our credit lines, all of that, right? What's the funding? And but there's a first person dimension of what's our emotional relationship to it, what's our narrative, what's our experience of having money or not having it, and so how do we explore that and open that up? And then what's the second person dimension around power dynamics with money, and how money and power often ends up impacting relationships in negative ways. So, like, if we talk about financial resilience, how might we expand that to not just talk about the communicating, the fundraising, those dimensions, but also kind of these first person and second person dimensions of our emotional relationship to it, and the interpersonal dynamics that are often caught up and impacted by money dynamics. So that's one way of thinking about the shadow piece in relationship to kind of financial resilience. But in terms of, like, the indicators, because you had mentioned that too, Ellen, that one of the things that I've really been struck by is, and you're right, it's like we started with kind of a conceptual model, and now we've been in the process of kind of applying it and learning how to translate it into really specific kind of use cases and applications, and kind of finding out how to do that in a skillful way. But it's like I've been really struck by presenting the framework to design students at the California College of Arts and in New York at Parsons Design School and similar places, where these design students are having these social impact projects that they are part of their social lab course. And we work with the cards, we work with the framework, and basically I ask them, what kind of impact do you want to have? Do you want to transform hearts and minds, or do you want to transform systems? Do you want to change relationships, or do you want to change behavior? Like, if you could just pick one of those as, like, the primary area of impact, which one would it be, right? And that helps them start to focus, like, well, I want to really change hearts and minds, or no, like, that's secondary. What we really need to do is change systems. So then that helps us start to think about, okay, well, what indicators might you use then? What metrics might you use to then measure that kind of impact? Because when we just have impact as this kind of big bucket of, oh, I want to have impact, what I often see is, like, you'll want to transform the system, but then you'll use metrics and indicators that aren't really geared towards measuring those systemic changes. Or you want to change, behavior, but you're using indicators that are more around participatory relational dynamics, right? So just getting the indicators to line up with the actual kind of impact that you want to have is, like, a huge step forward. And of course you can say, well, I want to have all four kinds of impact, and then we can talk about how do you do that. Or maybe you just want to really focus on clear and wide, right? And so that helps us start to design. And what's fascinating with these students, and even with the practitioners, some of whom are here that have been in our programs, is they start to realize how much creativity and autonomy they have in terms of designing which indicators they use to measure impact. On the one hand, there's tons of indicators on the shelf that you can pull off and plug and play. Like, there's a lot of different metrics out there, a lot of different KPIs, a lot of, we're coming out of our ears with these things. So there's tons available. But you also can just design what you want and need for real specific uses, informed by some of those other metrics, or doing hybrids or augmentations of them. So there's a lot of room for creativity around choosing and figuring out what kinds of metrics might you use, what kind of indicators to address the kinds of impact that you want to have. And then you can start to get really fancy and pick indicators and metrics that can have multiple kinds of impact, right? That are having clear impact and deep impact at the same time. And because you're able to use the data and measure the data and present it in a couple different ways to show that you're having both kinds of impact, right? So this is kind of coming back to some of what Shanti was saying. It's like this word impact is used in so many different ways that when I'm talking with nonprofits, in some cases, what they mean or want it to mean is really different than, a conscious capitalism, which is kind of more in the business world and kind of trying to do more kind of mainstream moves, but is trying to do it with heart and a social conscience, right? So part of it's like, we just have to get more clear about what's this word, and once we define it and get more clear on it, then that plays a big role with the kind of indicators and how we might design assessing the impact we're having. So let me stop there and just invite other people to add in or take us in a different direction. Shanti? Wait, you're on mute. Now
yeah,
you're...
I just wanted to throw a couple of things on top there. So the UN Sustainable Development Goals, so there's these 17 goals, and there's an organization, SDG Compass, is working with the UN to try and create a list of comprehensive metrics that people can use. And I kind of took a close look at about, I looked over the 1,600 metrics that they have listed in their chart, right. And almost none of them have to do with anything involving interiority. And so most of you are probably aware of, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? The base foundation has to be set, and that's critically important. And that can be measured by third person, scientific objective measurement. But you get above kind of the safety level in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where we're really at when we're thriving and transforming the world the way we want to be transforming it. You have to take into account first and second person what's going on there. And so what are you talking about when you want impact? And the third person is important, but the first and second person is critical to move beyond, just the baseline, the base of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah, and just to build on that, those goals, it's like they're almost exclusively talking about clear impact, the transformation of behaviors and bodies, or high impact, the transformation of environments and systems. And as Shanti was saying, they really have nothing to say about the transformation of minds and hearts, deep impact, or the transformation of relationships and culture, right? So I was part of the Peace Corps. So we were great about going into communities and building latrines and wells, and we could check the box on clear impact and high impact. But we ended up screwing up the culture, and the relationships between individuals in those communities. And we didn't have a way of measuring that or even seeing it, even though we could kind of sense like something was off. Because, for instance, these latrines that we made, there was a gap on the door at the bottom. And it turns out that if you can see someone's feet when they're going to the restroom, that's a big taboo. And so women wouldn't use these public latrines because there was this little gap at the bottom, right? So, but we were able in our report to say, hey, yeah, we're having high impact. We're changing the system now. There's 10 latrines in this region and this and that. But the cultural fabric and the cohesion of the community was being negatively impacted, but there wasn't a way of capturing that. So you can take those goals, the UN goals, and you can actually measure, even though they're all primarily about clear and high impact, so third person, outcome, you can actually bring first and second person measurements to all of them. So it's not that you necessarily need the UN to adopt a bunch of, first and second person, sustainable millennial goals. You can just bring an integral approach to measurement to those goals that they already have. And this is something Marilyn Hamilton and I are starting to do in the context of cities, because these eco-cities organization has a similar set of about 19, areas of measurement that are part of their, lineup. And only 2 of them, one deals with quality of life and one deals with culture. So only 2 of them out of all of them really deal with, deep impact and wide impact. So it's going to be hard to get them to adopt additional categories that better showcase deep and wide impact. But you can bring an integral approach to the ones they already have and start to measure those realities in an integral way. All right, who else?
I maybe want to jump on that too. Sean, what you just hinted to is also why often when we are bringing the MetaImpact Framework to groups and organizations, so it's first a tool, I think, that has been seen as to track the existing values. But what I'm also hearing, Sean, is the complexity that comes through impact. Your example with the latrines, I think we all have these history of where we are impacting something in a really with our full heart on, and then down the line it has actually a negative impact in some of these quadrants. So it's almost like the complexity of impact. That's what I'm also hearing here right now. And why climate change is something that we all want to do, but electric cars are fantastic. And if hydroelectricity is what I'm banking on, and I'm destroying all the river flows and all the fish that cannot travel upstream anymore, I mean, these are complex issues that I have to be aware of. So measure the impact, also keeping the complexity, sensibility alive. And with that comes the shadow that we touched on. Several of viewers mentioned that this is one of important pieces to track as well.
Right, and this highlights, it's beautiful, Claudia, that because our culture and our systems has primarily been hyper-focused on financial return, that's often been at the expense of the value in the other 9 capitals, right? So by creating a checks and balance system where you're including psychological capital and social capital and human capital, you still can have the financial return be good, right? But maybe it's lower than it might be, but it's done in a way where the other capitals are not negatively impacted. So you can find those balance points, right? So instead of having a 20% financial return and screwing up the other capitals, you could have a 10% return and have pretty good positive impact in the other one. So you can start to identify, those thresholds and engage in projects where you're creating a balance of impact so that positive impact in financial capital is not negatively impacting social, cultural, psychological, spiritual capital, right? And so you can find a way to design for a wisdom economy where you're preserving the wholeness of individuals and systems through this kind of multidimensional approach that we've been exploring and pioneering. All right, who else? We have about 15 more minutes. Conversation's just getting juicy. Yeah, Ellen? Oh, wait, let's unmute you.
Just a question about can you hear me? Yeah. So the question about the capitals. So that's so fascinating to me. And I was going through your presentation of the cards, and I was wondering how much you're defining them, because they all resonate, right? It's about whole person, whole system, and everything. But I was wondering, and if you have a practical example how you use them maybe in any of the projects that you're involved in, how you use many of the capitals and translate it maybe into indicators.
Yeah, great. We'll spend more time on the capitals in the next call because it links with the theme there, but I'll highlight just a few teasers to have you all be inspired to join us for the next one. We do have a definition for all of them. All the 10 capitals we use are anchored in the academic and research and metric literature, right? So we haven't made any of them up. Like all of them have a long history, some are longer than others, but they're all been around and have definitions that have been developed. I mean, in some cases, you'll have competing definitions and different people defining some of the capitals in different ways. But we have, simple definitions for all of them. They do appear on the card, so you'll see those. Our approach is that you don't have to use all 10. Like you can just use 2 or 3 or 4. So you can decide, how many you need to use. You don't have to try and have a comprehensive, multi-capital approach. But one consideration we do like to emphasize is that in many cases, it is good to have at least one form of capital from each of the 4 types of impact. So you have one capital that represents high impact, which is usually financial capital. You have one impact, one capital that's, represents clear impact, and that's usually human capital and like skills and capacity and know-how. And then you have a capital that represents deep impact, which is usually psychological capital. And what's the resilience and emotional stability and optimism of an individual and their sense of kind of egoic resilience in the face of challenges and difficulties. And then you have a capital that represents the wide impact, which is usually social capital. So you can use the capitals in a lot of different ways, and then obviously each capital can then be measured in first, second, and third person. So you can measure, third person financial capital, third person human capital, and then a second person psychological capital, and then a first person social capital. So there's a lot of different ways you can design and work with the capitals and the different first, second, third person metrics and the different impacts to really tailor, what you need for your situation. And for us, one of the main goals is to tell better stories. People and organizations are having a lot of amazing impact out there, and they're leaving a lot of impact on the table, and they're not able to tell a story of how much impact they're having. For instance, I like to tell the story of this organization, a forklift company, that was primarily selling themselves on 4 types of impact that they were having and they were measuring. But when I looked at their data of all the things the customers were saying they liked about the company, they had statements that fit into all 10 types of capital. And so by showing that to them, they started to be able to tell a more powerful story about the impact they were having. And then they started to be able to design to increase those other types of impact that they weren't even really consciously including, right? So to me, it's like when nonprofits and even like conscious business and conscious capitalism, so much of it is like, how do we tell the story that touches our hearts and inspires us into action and gives us hope for the future? It's generally not about statistics and kind of the typical third person metrics that are kind of run rampant. Like it's usually anchored to some degree in first and second person, data points and elements. And so how do we combine those? And so I think the 10 types of capital give us a nice differentiation across the core types of value that we can then tune into and do a better job of highlighting and making visible. Just a second, Brian, let me see if anyone else wants to jump in that we haven't heard from yet. All right, you're on.
So a lot of my experience over the last 4 years has been interrelating with the Presencing Institute and U theory, or the U journeys, which are basically, it's a co-creative process that involving primarily innovation and design, with at least a small group, core group. So what I'm really interested in your work, Sean, is that co-creative process in terms of translating the collective dimensions and respective relationships kind of through a prototyping. It seems to me that this is kind of been the process over the last 4 or 5 years for us, is to familiarize practitioners, learners with the co-creative process, and then to design and innovate a prototype, and then take that prototype to scale. So I see how greater attention, I made a note to myself, how greater attention to the meta capital gives you discretionary kind of input or management of that design process to some extent for the well-being of the ecosystem. And
yeah, recently I've been in conversation with some people from the Presencing Institute, and I ended up writing like a 2 or 3 page kind of little overview of how the MetaImpact Framework interfaces with U theory and the practice of presencing. And there's a lot of ways you can use the practice of presencing to co-create in a participatory context first and second person methodologies to measure impact in different areas. So there's some really cool ways that the two are very complementary. And so I'll continue to kind of develop that because I think it's an exciting area. And, you know, the MetaImpact Framework includes these second person metrics for all 10 capitals. And one way that defines the second person metrics is the participatory nature of them. So a lot of the second person methodologies are primarily participatory. And so a lot of the nonprofits are really drawn to those methodologies because it matches well with their values and their approach to impact, which is often a lot of nonprofits really focus on wide impact. Fewer are focused on deep impact. So wide impact around relationships and culture really lends itself to participatory methodologies. But it's fascinating to look at how there's participatory methodologies for all 4 types of impact. So you can use participatory methodologies like presencing to have deep impact. You can also use them to change behaviors and around health and know-how. You can also use them to change the systems around the natural world, financial systems, and what we call manufactured capital, right? So the participatory methods, while they're often associated with wide impact, can be leveraged to deepen impact in all 4 of the areas that we work with. And this is one of the great things about the framework, because I think it helps us see how something we associate in one area can actually be used in powerful ways to deepen impact in other areas. All right, so we just have a couple minutes before I want to turn it over to Claudia to talk about the next conversation and some other things. Any final comments or questions that we might not be able to engage, but at least can put out there, Shanti?
I just wanted to add one thing real quick onto that conversation. So the MetaImpact Framework is a 3-dimensional framework, and when you look at it, it's not a linear methodology. And so one of the things that's key, if you're talking about presencing and you're kind of like looking to go unencumbered into a collective vision of what is possible, right? So then how are you going to work backwards from there to what you want to create? And are you going to be as innovative and comprehensive in determining what kind of impact you want? And how are you going to get clearer about that? And how are you going to bring it forward without just depending upon whatever existing metrics you already have? And the MetaImpact Framework can provide really powerful insight in that regard.
Yeah, I often talk about the framework as cultivating multidimensional thinking, which for me is even different than integrative thinking. It's like taking integrative thinking to like the next level, because there are a number of kind of dynamic dimensions of the framework that you can play with and design with in a number of powerful ways. And as you get more familiar with them, you start to see how they fold into each other and complement each other and amplify each other. And so this kind of integrative / multidimensional thinking, I think, is a powerful aspect of it, because the more you work with it, it cultivates that quality of embodied awareness in yourself, right? And I think a lot of us are looking for practices and frameworks that actually, are psychoactive catalysts for our own evolution, right? Opposed to just kind of, a lot of approaches that are just kind of linear and follow the steps, color the numbers. So let me turn it over to Claudia to just wrap things up. This is the first of several conversations, so excited to continue this with all of you and others. So Claudia, please share with us.
Yeah, so that was very exciting, and I was like, wow, maybe an hour is not long enough to engage into this conversation. But so we have more to come, as Sean just mentioned, and you all know. So this is the first one of 4 calls, and they're all spaced out about like 3 to 4 weeks apart. So the next one is on November 15th, and so we really want to explore a little bit more about how we're moving from the dysfunctional monocapitalism into a thriving multi-capitalism, and what does it really mean? And then the next one, we are looking more into integral data and how to measure what matters. That's shortly before Christmas on the 18th of December. And then the last one is really looking a little bit further into the triple bottom line and what is beyond. And then we are launching, we have launched already the registration for our online master course. That's the second one. We are holding. That begins February 28th and goes until the beginning of May. Registration is open. We have an early bird special that ends in about 3 weeks, on the 20th of November. And so registration is open, and then we are going to announce very shortly a 5 days in-person seminar in Southern Australia, which will be exactly in a year from now. And here we're really looking into designing impact for health and aged care. This is one of our focuses that we're having, but we really will take a deep dive with people from all over the world into the MetaImpact Framework. This is a follow-up of an in-person seminar that we had in Iceland earlier this year. And so that's kind of what's cooking. And then there's a couple of in-person seminars that we are designing in the process of finalizing. Some of them will be in the East Coast. Then there will be some here on the West Coast of the US. And then we're also looking to returning to Iceland next spring, and excited about all the things that are moving. So that's pretty much it. So I will hand over back to Sean to close us all up, and say already from my side, thank you so very much for joining us, and those who are listening to the recording, we hope to see you soon next time.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Claudia, and thank you all for joining us. We'll see you in a month, and feel free to reach out to us, email us if you have follow-up questions or things you want to engage us with that we weren't able to get into tonight. But so sending lots of love to all of you, and look forward to the next opportunity to connect. All right. Bye, everyone.
Great to have you all on the call. Blessings.
Bye. Thank you all.